Everyone feared the mafia boss's fiancée, but the new waitress changed everything when she... Clean it up! Sienna hissed, her voice a razor sliding through the dead silence of the VIP lounge. And then get on your knees and apologize to my shoes. Lucy stared at the shattered crystal and the dark red wine bleeding into the plush carpet. Her hands trembled, but as she looked up into the cruel eyes of the woman everyone in the city feared, a strange calm washed over her. "No," Lucy said softly.
The entire room stopped breathing. The armed men by the door tensed. From the shadows of the velvet booth, Asher, the man who owned the city's underworld, slowly leaned forward, his dark eyes locking on to the new waitress who had just signed her own death warrant. The Velvet Room was not a restaurant. It was a sanctuary for the city's most dangerous predators. Nestled in the heart of the financial district, its unmarked doors opened only to those who possessed a lethal combination of unimaginable wealth and untouchable power. Inside, the air was perpetually thick with the scent of aged mahogany, expensive cigars, and the faint, metallic underlying tang of fear. The lighting was kept deliberately low, casting long, dramatic shadows across the faces of men who made decisions that ruined lives before their first course was cleared. For Lucy, it was simply a place that paid double the standard hourly wage, a necessity born out of quiet desperation. Her younger sister's medical bills were a rising tide, and the Velvet Room was the only lifeboat in sight. She had been warned about Booth 1. The general manager, a nervous man who sweated profusely despite the climate-controlled air, had pulled her aside on her first night. He had pointed a trembling finger toward the elevated circular booth shrouded by heavy velvet curtains. "That is Asher's table. And where Asher is, Sienna follows. You do not look them in the eye. You do not speak unless spoken to. If she asks for the moon, you ask how she wants it plated." Sienna was the daughter of the rival syndicate's head, betrothed to Asher in a bloodless merger that kept the city from erupting into all-out war. She wielded her position like a medieval queen, delighting in the terror she inspired. She was beautiful, sharp-edged, and entirely merciless. Tonight, the tension in the room was suffocating. Asher sat in the corner of the booth, a portrait of lethal stillness. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, his broad shoulders relaxed, his dark hair catching the dim, ambient light. He rarely spoke, letting his mere presence dominate the room. Beside him, Sienna was a hurricane of restless, malicious energy. She wore a crimson dress that looked like spilled blood, her manicured nails tapping an erratic rhythm against the polished wood of the table. Lucy approached with a silver tray bearing a single bottle of vintage Barolo and 2 crystal glasses. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She kept her eyes focused on the table, moving with practiced, invisible grace. She placed the glasses down. She uncorked the bottle, the soft pop sounding like a gunshot in the hushed environment. As she reached over to pour, Sienna abruptly shifted, throwing her arm out in a wide, careless gesture as she complained about the city's mayor to one of the guards. Her diamond-laden wrist collided violently with the heavy crystal glass just as Lucy began to pour. The glass shattered against the edge of the table, sending a spray of dark red wine cascading down the front of Sienna's designer dress and splashing onto her pristine, white leather stilettos. Time stopped. The soft hum of jazz music from the corner stage seemed to fade into nothingness. The conversations at the surrounding tables died instantly. Every eye in the Velvet Room snapped toward Booth 1. Lucy froze, the neck of the wine bottle still gripped tightly in her hand. She watched as Sienna looked down at her stained dress, her perfectly contoured face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. Sienna stood up slowly. The chair scraped harshly against the floor. She stepped out of the booth, towering over Lucy in her heels. The air grew frigid. Sienna's bodyguards, massive men with bulges beneath their tailored jackets, stepped forward, their hands drifting toward their waistbands.
"Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Sienna whispered, the softness of her voice far more terrifying than a scream. She pointed a trembling finger at the floor. "Clean it up, and then get on your knees and apologize to my shoes."
The words hung in the air, venomous and absolute. The manager, watching from the bar, squeezed his eyes shut. The other waitresses backed away, melting into the shadows. This was the moment where people broke. This was the moment where pride was traded for survival. Lucy looked down at the shattered glass, the ruined wine, and the stained leather. She felt the eyes of the entire room pressing down on her spine, waiting for her to crumble. But as Lucy looked back up at Sienna, she didn't feel fear. She felt a deep, overwhelming exhaustion. She was tired of bowing to a world that took everything and gave nothing. She was tired of the medical debt, the late-night tears, the constant grinding anxiety. And in this opulent room, surrounded by monsters in bespoke suits, a fragile steel-wire line of defiance snapped tight within her chest. She straightened her posture. She looked directly into Sienna's furious, widened eyes.
"No," Lucy said softly. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy enough to crush bone.
The word hung in the air, a single, impossible syllable that defied the fundamental laws of the Velvet Room. Sienna blinked, genuinely stunned, as if Lucy had suddenly spoken in a dead language. For a fraction of a second, the Mafia princess simply stared, her brain struggling to process the reality of a waitress refusing a direct command. Then the shock melted away, replaced by a volcanic, terrifying fury. "What did you say to me?" Sienna shrieked, all pretense of icy composure shattering. She raised her hand, her heavy diamond rings glinting in the low light, prepared to strike Lucy across the face with enough force to draw blood. Lucy didn't flinch. She didn't raise her hands to protect herself. She simply stood her ground, her chin tilted slightly upward, her eyes locked on the descending hand. "Enough!" The voice was not loud, but it possessed a baritone weight that resonated through the floorboards. It cut through Sienna's scream like a blade. Sienna's hand froze mid-air, inches from Lucy's cheek. From the depths of the velvet booth, Asher leaned forward. The shadows fell away from his face, revealing sharp, aristocratic features and eyes, so dark they looked like polished obsidian. He didn't look angry, he looked intensely, unnervingly focused. He wasn't looking at Sienna, his gaze was entirely consumed by Lucy. He analyzed her in the span of 3 seconds. He saw the fraying cuffs of her standard-issue white shirt. He saw the dark circles of exhaustion beneath her eyes. But more importantly, he saw the unwavering stillness of her posture. In his world, people begged, they bargained, they wept, and they knelt. No one, absolutely no one, stood in the face of imminent violence with such quiet, absolute dignity. It wasn't the foolish bravery of someone who didn't understand the danger. It was the resolute defiance of someone who had decided that her self-worth was the only thing left she truly owned.
"Asher!" Sienna snapped, turning to him, her voice trembling with indignation. "Did you hear what this—" "I heard her," Asher interrupted, his voice a low, soothing rumble that carried a terrifying undertone of authority. He slowly stood up, buttoning his jacket with a casual elegance that belied the tension in the room. He stepped out of the booth and walked over to where they stood. He towered over both of them, exuding an aura of absolute control.
He looked down at the spilled wine, then at Sienna's ruined shoes, and finally his gaze returned to Lucy. "Are you injured?" Asher asked. The question sent a ripple of shock through the room. Sienna gasped, taking a step back as if struck. The bodyguards exchanged confused, panicked glances. The manager behind the bar dropped a glass, the shattering sound echoing loudly, but no one looked his way. "No, sir," Lucy replied, her voice steady, though her hands were still trembling at her sides. "Good," Asher said, his eyes never leaving hers. "Go to the kitchen. Have them send someone out with a mop." "Asher!" Sienna screamed, her face flushing a deep, mottled red. "You cannot be serious. She ruined my dress. She insulted me in front of half the families in this city. She needs to be taught a lesson." Asher finally turned his head to look at his fiancée. His expression was a terrifying blankness, a void devoid of any warmth or affection. "It was an accident, Sienna. You moved your arm. The glass broke. She will not kneel to you for a mistake you initiated." "I am your future wife," Sienna hissed, stepping closer to him, lowering her voice so only the three of them could hear. "If you do not punish her, you make me look weak. You make us look weak. Power is not proven by breaking those who have nothing," Asher replied softly, the words laced with a dangerous chill. "Power is having the restraint not to. Do not mistake my patience for submission, Sienna. Now go home. Change your dress. We are done here for the evening." Sienna stared at him, her chest heaving with rage. She looked at Lucy, her eyes promising a slow, agonizing retribution, before spinning on her heel and storming out of the restaurant, her bodyguard scrambling to follow in her wake. The heavy mahogany doors slammed shut behind her, echoing like thunder. Asher stood in the silence for a moment. He looked back at Lucy, who was still standing by the shattered glass. "I told you to go to the kitchen," he said, his tone softer now, almost conversational. "I thought you were going to let her hit me," Lucy admitted, the words slipping out before she could stop them. A ghost of a smirk played at the corner of Asher's mouth. "I don't let anyone get hit in my establishment unless they truly deserve it. Go, your shift is over." Lucy turned and walked away, feeling the heat of his gaze burning into her spine until the swinging doors of the kitchen finally swallowed her whole. The kitchen was a madhouse of panicked whispers when Lucy walked in. The line cook stared at her as if she were a ghost, an apparition walking among the living. The head chef, a massive man with a thick beard and a temperament to match the heat of his stoves, grabbed her by the shoulders and practically shoved her into the small, cramped break room in the back.
"Are you insane?" he hissed, wiping sweat from his forehead with a stained towel. "Do you have a death wish, Lucy? That was Sienna. You don't say no to Sienna. People end up in the river for looking at her wrong." "I couldn't do it, chef," Lucy said, collapsing onto a rickety plastic chair. The adrenaline was finally leaving her system, leaving behind a cold, shaking exhaustion. I couldn't get on my knees. I wouldn't."
The chef sighed, a heavy, sorrowful sound. "Well, you better pack your locker. Even if the boss lets you walk away tonight, he's going to have to fire you. He can't keep you here. The optics are too bad. Sienna will demand your head by morning." Lucy nodded slowly. She knew he was right. The brief victory of her dignity was entirely overshadowed by the crushing reality of her financial ruin. Without this job, she couldn't afford her sister's next round of treatments. She had chosen her pride over her family's survival, and the guilt began to settle heavy and dark in her chest. She changed out of her uniform in silence, her movements mechanical. She packed her small duffel bag, folded her apron neatly, and left it on the manager's desk. As she walked toward the back exit, stepping out into the cool, damp night air of the alleyway, a massive, imposing figure blocked her path, It was one of Asher's personal guards, a man named Marcus, whose face was a map of old scars. "The boss wants to see you," Marcus said, his voice a gravelly rumble. Lucy's stomach plummeted. This was it. The chef was wrong about her getting fired in the morning. Asher was going to do it tonight, quietly, away from the eyes of the patrons. She nodded, following Marcus up a hidden flight of stairs that led from the alley directly to the private offices above the restaurant. She was ushered into a sprawling, elegantly minimalist office. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, the glittering lights stretching out into the darkness like scattered diamonds. Asher sat behind a massive oak desk, a glass of amber liquid resting in his hand. He looked up as she entered, nodding once to Marcus, who quietly closed the door, leaving them alone. "Sit," Asher said, gesturing to a leather chair opposite him. Lucy sat down, keeping her back perfectly straight. She clutched her duffel bag in her lap like a shield. "You're not fired," Asher said, completely bypassing any preamble. Lucy blinked, her carefully constructed composure faltering for a second. I'm not? No." Asher took a slow sip of his drink. "If I fire you, I validate Sienna's tantrum. I show the city that my fiancée dictates the operations of my territory. I do not take orders from her, and I will not start over a spilled glass of wine." "But she will demand it," Lucy said quietly, surprised by her own boldness. "She won't let this go. People like her never let it go." Asher's eyes darkened slightly, a flare of genuine interest sparking in his gaze. "People like her. And what do you know about people like her, Lucy?" "I know that people born with power treat it like a toy," Lucy replied, her voice steadying. "And when someone takes their toy away or refuses to play their game, they break things. They break people. Because they can." Asher set his glass down. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, steepling his fingers. "And yet, knowing that, you still refused to kneel." Lucy looked away, her gaze drifting to the sprawling city lights. "My younger sister has a degenerative bone disease. I spend every waking hour outside of this place fighting insurance companies, fighting doctors, fighting a system that wants to sweep us under the rug because we don't have money. I spend my life begging on the phone, begging for extensions, begging for a break." She turned her eyes back to Asher, her gaze fiercely bright. "I am on my knees every single day of my life, mister."
"Asher, I will not do it in a beautiful dress for a woman whose only hardship is a stained shoe."
Silence stretched between them, thick and pregnant, with unspoken understanding. Asher stared at her, truly seeing the hidden bruises she carried, the invisible weight that bowed her shoulders but could not snap her spine. In his world of monsters and sycophants, of calculated lies and constant betrayals, her raw, bleeding honesty was the most disarming weapon he had ever faced. "Just Asher," he said softly. "Excuse me? Do not call me Mr. Asher. Just Asher." He leaned back in his chair. "You will return to work tomorrow for your regular shift. You will not be reassigned. In fact, from now on, whenever Sienna dines here, you will be her exclusive server." Lucy stared at him in horror. "You want me to serve her? Why? That's practically throwing me to the wolves." "Because," Asher said, a slow, predatory smile touching his lips for the first time, "I want her to see that her rage means nothing. I want her to look at you and remember that she could not break you. And I want to watch you prove it." The following week was a masterclass in psychological warfare. True to her nature, Sienna returned to the Velvet Room 3 times, always surrounded by a different entourage of wealthy, sycophantic friends. And true to Asher's command, Lucy was assigned as their exclusive server. The restaurant staff watched with bated breath, treating Lucy like a soldier walking through an active minefield. Sienna tried everything to break her. She ordered complicated, off-menu dishes with contradictory dietary restrictions, hoping the kitchen would fail. When Lucy delivered the food perfectly, Sienna claimed the soup was cold and demanded it be remade. She intentionally dropped her napkin repeatedly, forcing Lucy to bend down and retrieve it. She spoke loudly about the help, making cruel, pointed remarks about people who smelled like public transportation and desperation. Through it all, Lucy was a fortress of ice. She did not smile, but she did not frown. She moved with an eerie, mechanical perfection, her voice a calm, soothing monotone that offered no foothold for Sienna's barbed insults. When Sienna demanded a new fork, Lucy produced one instantly from her apron. When Sienna tried to trip her by sticking a foot out into the aisle, Lucy gracefully sidestepped it without spilling a drop of water from the pitcher she carried, not even acknowledging the attempt. Lucy's flawless performance began to have an unintended effect. Sienna's friends grew visibly uncomfortable with the one-sided bullying. Sienna herself grew increasingly erratic, her voice rising in pitch, her composure fracturing. She looked unhinged, petty, and cruel, while the quiet waitress looked composed, elegant, and entirely unbothered. And from the high balcony overlooking the main floor, Asher watched every single interaction. He found himself ignoring the ledgers and syndicate reports on his desk, drawn instead to the glass railing to observe the silent battle below. He watched the way the soft restaurant lighting caught the simple line of Lucy's jaw. He watched the incredible restraint it took for her to absorb Sienna's venom without reflecting it back. He was captivated. Asher had been raised in a golden cage. His life, his empire, his engagement to Sienna, it had all been orchestrated by his father before his death. The merger of their two families was a strategic necessity to prevent a turf war that would have burned the city to the ground. He did not love Sienna. He barely tolerated her. She was a political asset, a spoiled, vicious creature who understood only fear and dominance. Asher had long accepted that his life would be devoid of genuine connection.
He was a king, but he was also a prisoner.
But watching Lucy, he felt a strange, terrifying crack in his armor. Here was a woman with no power, no money, and no protection, yet she possessed a freedom of spirit he had never known. She owned herself. She could not be bought, and she could not be broken. On Thursday night, the tension finally boiled over. Sienna, enraged by her inability to provoke a reaction, threw a handful of cash onto the floor as she prepared to leave.
"Clean up my mess, peasant," Sienna sneered, laughing sharply with her friends. Lucy stood perfectly still. The dining room went quiet. Asher, standing on the balcony, gripped the railing so tightly his knuckles turned white. He was seconds away from intervening, from publicly humiliating Sienna to end the torment. But Lucy handled it herself. She did not bend down to pick up the money. Instead, she turned to the nearby busboy, a young teenager working his first week.
"Thomas," Lucy said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "The lady has decided to leave an excessively generous tip for your excellent table-clearing skills tonight. Please gather it and make sure you thank her for her charity." Sienna's jaw dropped. The insult was brilliant. Lucy had completely reframed the humiliation, turning it into a moment of forced philanthropy. Thomas, wide-eyed, scrambled over and began picking up the $100 bills, repeatedly thanking a stunned, furious Sienna. A low, rich sound echoed from the balcony. It took a moment for the patrons to realize what it was. Asher was laughing. It was a dark, genuine sound that shocked everyone in the room. Sienna snapped her head upward, looking at her fiancé. She saw him looking down, not at her, but at the waitress. She saw the admiration in his dark eyes, the respect, the undeniable burning focus. In that moment, Sienna realized that this was no longer about a spilled glass of wine. This was about power, and she was losing it. The seed of a terrible, violent jealousy took root in her heart, blossoming into a cold, calculated decision. If she could not break the waitress's pride inside the restaurant, she would break her body outside of it. The rain was falling in heavy, relentless sheets when Lucy's shift ended on Saturday night. The city felt hostile, the neon lights bleeding into the wet pavement like toxic spills. She was exhausted, her bones aching with a deep, persistent fatigue. The psychological warfare with Sienna had taken a heavier toll than she let on. Every night she went home to her sister, pasting on a brave smile, pretending she wasn't terrified that the Mafia princess would eventually escalate the conflict. She pushed open the heavy steel door at the back of the restaurant, stepping out into the dark, narrow alleyway. She pulled the collar of her thin coat up against the driving rain, hurrying toward the street where she caught her late-night bus. She made it 10 paces before shadows detached themselves from the brick walls. 2 men stepped into her path, blocking the exit to the street. They were massive, their faces obscured by the brims of their hats and the driving rain. Lucy turned around, intending to go back into the restaurant, but a third man had stepped out from behind a dumpster, cutting off her retreat. Her heart slammed against her ribs. The cold rain soaked through her clothes instantly, but the chill she felt was pure, primal terror.
"Going somewhere, sweetheart?" the largest man asked. He had a thick, guttural voice and a scar that snaked down his jawline. "Let me pass," Lucy said, trying to keep her voice steady, though it trembled violently. "Not tonight," the man said, stepping closer. "Our boss's lady feels like you haven't learned your lesson yet. She thinks you need a permanent reminder of your place. A broken arm, maybe, or a scar to ruin that pretty face."
He reached into his coat, pulling out a heavy steel baton. The metal gleamed wetly in the dim alley light. Lucy backed up until her shoulders hit the rough, wet brick of the building. There was nowhere to run. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the impact, praying that whatever they did wouldn't leave her unable to work. A sudden, blinding light pierced the darkness of the alley. The heavy roar of a massive engine echoed off the brick walls. A sleek, black luxury sedan tore into the alleyway from the street, its high beams illuminating the 3 thugs. The car skidded to a halt mere inches from the largest man, splashing dirty water over his boots. The driver's side door opened. The rain seemed to slow down as Asher stepped out of the vehicle. He wore a dark trench coat, his face set in lines of absolute, murderous fury. He did not yell, he did not draw a weapon. He simply closed his car door with a heavy final thud and walked toward the men. The temperature in the alley plummeted. The 3 thugs froze, their bravado evaporating in an instant. They recognized him immediately. Everyone in the underworld knew the face of the king.
Asher," the leader stuttered, quickly lowering the steel baton. We were just following orders from Miss Sienna. She said—" "I don't care what she said," Asher interrupted, his voice a low, terrifying growl that easily cut through the sound of the driving rain. He stopped 2 feet away from the leader, staring him down with eyes that promised unimaginable violence. "If any of you so much as breathe in her direction again, I will personally ensure that your families cannot identify your bodies. Drop the weapon." The steel baton clattered instantly onto the wet pavement.
"Get out of my city," Asher commanded. "If I see your faces by morning, you won't see another sunrise. Run!" The 3 men didn't hesitate. They scrambled past the car, fleeing down the alleyway like frightened animals, disappearing into the rainy night.
Asher stood still for a moment, letting the rage subside. He turned slowly, looking at Lucy. She was pressed against the brick wall, soaked to the bone, shaking uncontrollably. Her eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of terror and overwhelming relief.
He walked over to her slowly, deliberately removing his heavy, dry trench coat. He wrapped it around her trembling shoulders, the warmth of his body heat lingering in the fabric. The coat dwarfed her, dragging on the ground, but it shielded her from the biting wind. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice entirely different now, soft, urgent, and laced with a vulnerability she had never heard before. "No," Lucy stammered, her teeth chattering. You saved me." "I should have protected you sooner," Asher said, his hand lingering for a fraction of a second on her shoulder. "I knew she was petty. I didn't think she would be stupid enough to use her father's men on my territory." He looked down at her, the rain plastering his dark hair to his forehead. "Come, I'm taking you home." He guided her to the passenger side of the car, opening the door for her. The interior was warm, smelling of rich leather and cedar. Asher got in the driver's seat and pulled out of the alley. They drove in silence for a long time. The neon lights of the city blurred through the rain-streaked windows. Asher drove her out of the wealthy financial district, deep into the grittier, neglected edges of the city where Lucy lived. When he finally pulled up to her rundown apartment complex, he put the car in park but left the engine running. "You can't go back to the restaurant, Lucy," Asher said quietly, staring straight ahead at the rain beating against the windshield. "It isn't safe anymore. Sienna has escalated this. If she's willing to send men after you, she won't stop until you're destroyed." "I have to," Lucy said, her voice tight with desperation. She pulled his coat tighter around herself. "I told you, my sister. I can't lose that paycheck. I'll fight them if I have to, but I can't quit." Asher finally turned to look at her. The street lamp outside cast a golden glow across his face. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a heavy, thick envelope, placing it on the center console between them. "There is enough in there to cover your sister's treatments for the next 5 years, Asher said. "Take it. Leave the city. Start over somewhere Sienna can't reach you." Lucy stared at the envelope. It was a lifeline. It was everything she had been praying for. But as she looked from the money to Asher's dark, tired eyes, she felt a profound sense of loss. She realized that she wasn't just fighting for her pride anymore. She had seen the man beneath the monster. She had seen the prisoner rattling the bars of his golden cage. "And what about you?" Lucy asked softly. Asher looked away, his jaw clenching. "I stay in the cage I was born into. It's the only world I know." Lucy reached out, her small, cold hand gently touching his arm. Asher flinched slightly at the contact, unaccustomed to such gentle, uncalculated touch. "You don't have to be a monster just because they expect you to be," Lucy whispered. She opened the car door, stepping out into the rain. She did not take the envelope. She left his trench coat folded neatly on the seat. "I'll see you tomorrow at 6, Asher." She closed the door, leaving him alone in the idling car, staring at the empty seat, the thick envelope of cash, and the terrifying realization that he was falling in love with a woman who was brave enough to refuse his salvation. The Obsidian was closed to the public on Friday. It was the night of the Syndicate Gala, a massive, highly secretive gathering of the city's 3 ruling crime families. Officially, it was a celebration of the upcoming fiscal year. Unofficially, it was the night the final terms of Asher and Sienna's marriage would be solidified, binding their empires together in blood and ink. The restaurant had been transformed. The tables were pushed together to form long, banqueting rows covered in black silk and adorned with blood-red roses. Armed men stood at every entrance, their eyes scanning the room with paranoid intensity. The air was thick with the smell of roasted meats, expensive scotch, and the heavy, suffocating weight of shifting power. Lucy was in the kitchen, her hands moving mechanically as she polished silverware. She had refused the money, she had returned to work. The chef had nearly suffered a stroke when she walked through the doors, but a single, quiet order from Asher's lieutenants had ensured she remained on the floor. "You're serving the head table tonight," the manager whispered, his face pale as he approached her station. "Asher requested it personally. God help us all." Lucy nodded, her expression stoic. Inside, her stomach was tied in agonizing knots. She knew what tonight meant for Asher. She knew the chains of his arranged marriage were being pulled tight, locking him away forever. Out in the main dining hall, the families began to arrive. Sienna made her grand entrance on the arm of her father, a brutally imposing man named Donatello, whose reputation for violence eclipsed even Asher's. Sienna was adorned in diamonds, a triumphant, gloating smile plastered on her face. She looked like a queen surveying her conquered territory. Asher stood by the bar, greeting the guests with a cold, formal detachment. He wore a midnight blue tuxedo, looking every inch the untouchable king. But when Sienna approached him, possessing his arm with a territorial grip, Lucy saw the microscopic tightening of his jaw, the deadness in his eyes. Before the dinner began, Lucy was sent to the large walk-in pantry to retrieve a specific vintage of champagne. The heavy metal door clicked shut behind her, plunging her into the chilly, brightly lit isolation of the cooler. She reached for the bottles on the top shelf, shivering slightly in the cold air. The heavy metal door unlatched and swung open. Sienna stepped into the cooler, her diamond heels clicking sharply against the tile floor. She closed the door behind her, leaning against it, blocking the only exit. "I have to admit," Sienna said, her voice dripping with toxic sweetness, "you are surprisingly difficult to get rid of like a stubborn cockroach. I hear my men disappointed me the other night in the alley." Lucy lowered the bottles of champagne, turning to face her. "If you want a drink, I can bring it to your table."
"I don't want a drink," Sienna snapped, stepping closer, her sweetness vanishing. "I want to know what kind of spell you've cast on my fiancé. He looks at you, he watches you, he defends a filthy, impoverished waitress against me, the daughter of Donatello. Why?" "There is no spell," Lucy said calmly, refusing to show fear. "He just respects people who don't treat the world like their personal playground."
Sienna laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Respect? You think a man like Asher respects you? He pities you. You're a stray dog he feels sorry for. But let me make something very clear to you, little girl." Sienna closed the distance between them, her face inches from Lucy's, her perfume sickeningly sweet in the enclosed space. "Tonight, our families merge. Tonight, Asher becomes mine in the eyes of the entire underworld. And the moment that ring goes on my finger, my first act as his wife will be to have you erased." Lucy's breath hitched. Sienna smiled, sensing the fear. "And not just you. I know all about your little sick sister in the municipal ward. It would be a tragedy if her life support machines experienced a sudden, inexplicable power failure. The hospital is in my father's territory after all."
A cold, paralyzing terror gripped Lucy's heart. She had endured the insults, she had survived the thugs in the alley, but this was a threat against the only thing she truly loved. The steel wire in her spine trembled, threatening to snap. "Leave her out of this," Lucy whispered, her voice finally breaking. "Then walk away tonight," Sienna hissed. "Disappear before the main course is served. If I see your face when the toasts begin, I make the phone call."
The heavy metal door of the cooler suddenly violently swung open, slamming against the outer wall. Asher stood in the doorway. The look on his face was terrifying. It wasn't the cold, calculating anger he usually displayed. It was a raw, primal fury. He had come looking for Lucy when the champagne was delayed, and he had heard enough. "Asher!" Sienna gasped, quickly smoothing her dress, her confident demeanor shattering. "I was just giving the waitress some instructions for the dinner." Asher didn't look at Sienna. He looked at Lucy. He saw the genuine, unadulterated terror in her eyes and the way she clutched the champagne bottles like a lifeline. He saw the tears threatening to spill over her lashes. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. Sienna had finally found Lucy's breaking point. Asher took a step into the cooler. He grabbed Sienna by the upper arm, his grip like a steel vise.
"You," Asher said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly whisper, "will go sit at the table. You will smile. You will not speak another word until I tell you to." "You're hurting me," Sienna whined, struggling against his grip. Asher shoved her out of the cooler, releasing her arm. "Walk."
Sienna stumbled out into the kitchen, her face pale, and hurried toward the dining room. Asher turned back to Lucy. He stepped close to her, gently taking the heavy bottles of champagne from her shaking hands and setting them on a crate. "Did she touch you?" he asked softly. "She threatened my sister," Lucy choked out, a single tear escaping down her cheek. "Asher, I can't let her hurt my sister." Asher reached up, his thumb gently wiping the tear from her cheek. The touch was incredibly tender, a stark contrast to the violence humming beneath his skin. "She will never touch your sister. She will never touch you," Asher vowed, his dark eyes burning with a sudden, absolute clarity. "I told you I was trapped in a cage, but I forgot who holds the keys." He turned and walked out of the cooler, leaving Lucy standing in the cold, a sudden, terrifying realization dawning on her. Asher wasn't going to submit to the marriage tonight. He was going to start a war. The atmosphere in the main dining hall was electric. The long tables were filled with the most ruthless men and women in the city. At the head table, Donatello sat like a bloated king, laughing loudly, his massive hands resting on the table. Sienna sat beside Asher, her face a mask of forced perfection, though her eyes darted nervously toward him. Asher sat entirely still, his posture rigid, his gaze focused on the far wall. It was time for the main course. Lucy emerged from the kitchen, pushing a heavy silver cart loaded with covered silver platters. The room went quiet as the service began, the clinking of glasses and soft murmurs of conversation filling the space. She moved with mechanical precision, serving the syndicate bosses, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm in her ears. She knew something catastrophic was about to happen. She could feel it in the air, like the pressure dropping before a massive hurricane. She arrived at the head table. She served Donatello, who didn't even acknowledge her existence. She moved to Sienna. As Lucy leaned over to place the heavy porcelain plate in front of Sienna, the Mafia princess saw an opportunity for one final, desperate act of petty cruelty. Perhaps she thought Asher wouldn't notice, or perhaps she was trying to prove a point to herself. As Lucy's arm extended across the table, Sienna intentionally knocked her heavy crystal water goblet over, but it wasn't just water. Sienna had positioned her heavy serrated steak knife precariously on the edge of her bread plate. The falling goblet caught the handle of the knife, flipping it upward and outward. The serrated blade sliced violently across the exposed skin of Lucy's inner forearm. Lucy gasped in pain, her arm recoiling involuntarily. The heavy silver platter slipped from her grasp, crashing onto the table with a deafening clatter, shattering plates and splashing hot food across the pristine silk tablecloth. Blood immediately began to well up from the deep gash on Lucy's arm, dripping down onto the white table linen in bright, shocking crimson drops. "Look what you've done, you clumsy idiot!" Sienna shrieked, jumping up from her chair, feigning outrage. The entire room erupted in chaos. Donatello stood up, cursing loudly. Guards shifted, hands moving to their weapons. Lucy grabbed her bleeding arm, taking a step back, her face pale with shock and pain. But as her sleeve tore further back, revealing the length of her forearm, Asher froze. He didn't look at the blood. He was staring at something just above the new cut. There, faded but undeniable, was an old, jagged burn scar. It was a specific shape, a crescent moon with a star inside it. It was the branding mark of a defunct, brutal human trafficking ring that Asher's father had dismantled 15 years ago. Asher had been a teenager then, forced by his father to watch the raids. He remembered seeing a terrified little girl, barely old enough to understand what was happening, clutching a younger baby in her arms, both of them marked with that horrifying brand. He had haunted him for years, the girl who had fought like a feral cat to protect her sibling. He looked at Lucy's face, seeing the fierce, unyielding protection she still harbored for her sister. The puzzle pieces violently slammed into place. She wasn't just a waitress who refused to kneel. She was a survivor of the very hell his family had helped create and destroy. She had been fighting her entire life. The cold, calculating mafia boss vanished. The man who had been dead inside for years roared to life.
Asher stood up. The movement was so sudden, so violent, that his heavy wooden chair tipped backward and crashed to the floor. The sound echoed like a gunshot, instantly silencing the chaotic room. He stepped around the table, ignoring Donatello, ignoring the ruined food. He walked directly to Sienna. Sienna looked at him, her faux outrage faltering under the sheer, murderous intensity radiating from him. "Asher, she ruined the dinner. She needs to be—" "He did it on purpose," Asher said. His voice was not loud. It was a terrifying, dead calm that sent a chill through every hardened criminal in the room. I bumped my glass," Sienna stammered, backing away. "You cut her," Asher stated, his eyes locking onto Sienna's. "You threatened her family in my kitchen. You sent men to break her legs in my alley, and you thought I would sit here and let you put a ring on my finger?"
Donatello stepped forward, his face purpling with rage. "Asher, watch your mouth. You are speaking to your future wife." Asher slowly turned his head to look at the massive syndicate boss. The silence in the room was absolute. Everyone knew they were witnessing history. "There is no marriage," Asher declared, his voice ringing clearly off the vaulted ceilings. "The engagement is broken. The alliance is dead. If you or your daughter ever step foot in my territory again, I will personally burn your empire to ash." Pandemonium. The word dead hadn't even fully left Asher's lips before the room exploded. Donatello roared, reaching for the heavy revolver holstered inside his jacket. But Asher was faster, his anticipation of the moment razor-sharp. "Now!" Asher shouted. Every single waiter, bartender, and busboy in the Velvet Room, men Asher had handpicked for their loyalty, not their hospitality, dropped their trays and drew weapons from beneath their aprons and serving stations. In less than 2 seconds, Donatello and his entire entourage found themselves staring down the barrels of 30 suppressed firearms. "Don't do it, Donatello!" Asher warned, his own hand resting casually on the gun at his waist. "You're surrounded by my men in my house. Draw that weapon, and you die before it clears leather." Donatello froze, his hand hovering over his chest. He looked around the room, the terrifying reality of the trap sinking in. Asher hadn't just broken the engagement. He had orchestrated a checkmate. Sienna was trembling violently, tears of genuine humiliation and terror streaming down her face. "You're ruining everything over a waitress? You're starting a war over trash?" Asher didn't bother to answer her. He turned his back on the rival boss, a display of absolute insulting dominance, and walked over to Lucy. She was still clutching her bleeding arm, leaning against the wall, her eyes wide with shock. Asher gently took her uninjured arm and pulled her behind the heavy mahogany bar, shielding her from the tense standoff in the room. He grabbed a clean, white linen napkin and began tightly wrapping it around the gash on her forearm to staunch the bleeding.
"I'm sorry," Asher said quietly, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he tied the knot. "I didn't mean for you to get hurt. I should have ended this before tonight." You just started a war," Lucy whispered, looking past him at the frozen tableau of armed men. "They're going to kill you, Asher."
"Let them try," he replied, his eyes meeting hers. The darkness was gone from his gaze, replaced by a fierce, burning light. "I have lived my entire life doing what was expected of me. I maintained the peace, I wore the crown, and I was suffocating to death. You showed me that I don't have to kneel to the circumstances of my birth." "I'm just a waitress," Lucy said, her voice shaking. "You are the bravest person I have ever met," Asher corrected her, his thumb gently tracing the edge of her jaw. "You stood up to a monster because of a spilled glass of wine. Did you really think I couldn't stand up to one to protect the woman I love?" Lucy's breath caught in her throat. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and undeniable, cutting through the chaos and the danger. He loved her. The untouchable king of the underworld had found his heart in the defiance of a girl with nothing to lose. "Escort them out," Asher commanded, his voice rising over the bar to address his men. "Take their weapons. If they resist, shoot them. Put them in their cars and send them back to the east side. The borders are closed." Slowly, agonizingly, Donatello's men surrendered their weapons. They were marched out of the restaurant at gunpoint. Sienna was sobbing now, the mascara running down her face in dark, ugly streaks, her empire of terror collapsing around her. She looked back at Asher one last time, but he wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Lucy. The heavy doors of the obsidian slammed shut, the locks engaging with a heavy, metallic finality. The restaurant was secure, but the silence that followed was heavy with impending violence. Donatello would not take this insult quietly. The war had begun. Asher pulled his cell phone from his pocket, dialing a number. "Marcus," he said, his voice returning to its authoritative bark. "Initiate Protocol Black. Seize the East Side docks. Freeze Donatello's offshore accounts. I want his lieutenants arrested by the corrupt cops on our payroll before sunrise. Break his knees before he can stand up." He hung up the phone and looked down at Lucy. "Come on," he said, taking her hand. "We need to get to the penthouse. It's heavily fortified. My men are already picking up your sister from the hospital and moving her to a secure private clinic. She'll be safe. I promise you, Lucy, they will never touch her." Lucy looked at his hand, large and warm, enveloping hers. She squeezed it tightly, letting him lead her up the hidden stairs, leaving the ruined, blood-stained dining room behind them. The penthouse was a fortress of steel and glass, suspended above the city. For the next 48 hours, it was the nerve center of a silent, brutal war. Lucy watched Asher work. He didn't sleep. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a phone pressed to his ear, orchestrating the systematic dismantling of Donatello's empire. He was ruthless, brilliant, and terrifyingly efficient. He used Donatello's own arrogance against him, striking at his supply lines, buying out his corrupt politicians, and turning his underbosses with promises of amnesty. He wasn't fighting a war of attrition, he was performing a surgical decapitation. On the morning of the third day, the sun rose over the city, casting a brilliant golden light across the skyline. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the streets washed clean. Asher stood by the window, his shoulders slumped slightly with exhaustion. He had taken off his jacket and tie, his sleeves rolled up, revealing the intricate dark tattoos that inked his forearms. He hung up the phone and placed it carefully on the desk. Lucy walked out of the bedroom, a fresh bandage wrapped around her arm. She wore one of his oversized shirts, feeling strangely at peace in the center of the storm. She walked over to him, standing quietly by his side. "It's over," Asher said softly, his voice rough with fatigue. Lucy looked up at him. "Donatello?" "He surrendered an hour ago," Asher replied, staring out at the city he now fully controlled. His lieutenants turned on him when the money stopped flowing. "Sienna and her father have been exiled. They are on a plane to Europe. If they ever return, my men will shoot them on sight. The east side is ours. The war is done." He turned to look at her. The heavy, suffocating weight that had always sat upon his shoulders seemed to have vanished. He looked younger, lighter. "And your sister is settled in the new clinic?" Asher continued, a soft smile touching his lips. "The doctors there are the best in the country. They believe they can halt the progression of the disease. The bills are paid, permanently." Tears welled up in Lucy's eyes, but this time they were tears of profound, overwhelming relief. The crushing weight she had carried for years, the desperate, endless fight for survival, was finally over. She threw her arms around Asher's neck, burying her face in his chest, sobbing quietly. Asher caught her, his strong arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her flush against him. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of her, grounding himself in the reality of her presence. He had burned down his entire world, risking everything he had ever known just to keep her safe. And he would do it 1,000 times over. "What happens now?" Lucy murmured against his chest, her tears soaking his shirt. "You're the undisputed king of the city. Everyone will fear you." Asher pulled back slightly, looking down into her eyes. He reached up, gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "They will fear me," Asher agreed, his voice a low, intimate rumble. "But I don't want to rule from the shadows anymore. I want to build something different, something legitimate. I want to tear down the casinos and build properties. I want to clean the money and walk in the daylight, but I can't do it alone." He stepped back, reaching into his pocket. He didn't pull out the gaudy blood diamond ring he had been forced to offer Sienna. Instead, he pulled out a simple, elegant band of plain white gold. It was understated, quiet, and profoundly real. "I have lived in a world of lies and monsters," Asher said, his dark eyes locking onto hers with burning intensity. "You are the only truth I have ever known, Lucy. You refused to kneel to the darkness, and you taught me how to stand up to it. Marry me, not as a hostage to a syndicate, but as my partner. Rule this city with me and help me change it." Lucy looked at the simple ring, then back up at the man who had risked his life to save hers. She saw the vulnerability in his eyes, the desperate hope of a man asking for salvation. She didn't hesitate. She didn't feel the need to think. The steel wire in her spine, the defiance that had kept her alive, melted into a deep, unwavering strength. "Yes," Lucy said softly, a brilliant, radiant smile breaking across her face. "Yes, I will." Asher slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. He pulled her in, kissing her with a desperate, consuming passion that spoke of years of loneliness finally ending. The sun broke fully over the horizon, flooding the penthouse with light, washing away the shadows of the past, and illuminating the dawn of a new empire. True power isn't measured by how much fear you can instill, but by the courage it takes to stand your ground when everyone else tells you to kneel. Lucy walked into a world of monsters armed with nothing but her dignity, and in doing so, she didn't just save herself, she saved the man who was meant to destroy her. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply say no. If this story of courage, unexpected love, and defying the odds resonated with you, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs a reminder of their own strength, and subscribe for more dramatic, emotional stories. Your support helps keep these narratives alive.